On the morning of February 28, 2005, a 64-year-old man named Michael Lefkow limped down the stairs inside of his home in Chicago, Illinois. He'd injured his Achilles tendon playing tennis the week before, so now he had a cast in his leg, and he had to get around on crutches. When Michael got into the kitchen, he saw his wife Joan making breakfast for the whole household, which included Michael, their teenage daughter Meg, and Joan's elderly mother, Donna, who had been living with them for the past 4 or 5 months. Michael said good morning to his wife, and then he hobbled his way through the kitchen over to the dining room where Meg was finishing up her eggs. And they chatted for a few minutes, and then the school bus honked outside, and Meg grabbed her backpack and raced past her dad on her way out the front door. A few moments later, Joan walked into the dining room as well with a plate of food for Michael and a cup of orange juice. And Michael thanked her, and then he asked her, "What's on the docket for you today?" And he meant that literally, because Joan was a federal judge. And, she had like a very heavy burden on her shoulders. She was routinely thrust into these cases where it was her job to make these just really difficult decisions. Decisions that, sometimes were sort of in that gray area between, is this the right moral decision or is this the right legal decision? And it was really her job to err on the side of legal. And the reality is she was a great judge, but sometimes her decisions would, put her in danger. This was, again, a very heavy burden, and it was something that Michael, being an attorney himself, definitely understood. He knew what it meant to be a judge. But, on this particular day, when Michael asked her what she was up to in court, it just sounded an awful lot like today was going to be very typical, sort of a run-of-the-mill day for her. Nothing too crazy, no big decisions looming. And so pretty soon, the two of them were just having their breakfast, and it was just a very relaxed morning. And at some point, Michael told Joan that because of his injury, he actually was not going into the office today. He was going to be working from home. And so pretty soon, they wrapped up their breakfast, they cleaned up, and then before long, Joan was ready to go. She grabbed her stuff, and she said goodbye to her husband, and then out the door she went, hopped in her car, and drove off to court. About half an hour later, around 9 a.m., Michael was getting ready to start his day at the house when he saw Joan's mother, Donna, coming down the stairs. Donna was 89 years old and needed 2 canes just to walk, and she'd been hospitalized for sepsis the previous year. So, since Joan and Michael had extra space in their home, they had offered to let her stay with them so she wouldn't be alone and they could help her if they needed to. And so Michael, despite being hurt himself, he immediately got up and hobbled over and helped Donna get down the last few steps, and then he led her back over to the dining room and helped her sit in her favorite chair. And then after she was situated and she said that she didn't need anything else, Michael thought, okay, now I'm going to start my day. And so he gathered up his things and he headed downstairs into the basement where his home office was. When Michael reached the bottom of the basement steps, he hobbled his way down this hallway that led to a door. He opened the door up, and inside was his home office. In he went, and he sat down at his desk, and there was already some files on the desk that he needed to sift through, and so he picked them up and began looking through the files, figuring out where he was going to start for the day. And as he was sitting there, he thought he heard something in the closet, the utility closet that was in the home office that he was in, and the door to the utility closet was shut. And he just sat there and he listened, and again, he heard what sounded like rustling or something inside of this closet. And so he thought, maybe it's the furnace that's, working extra hard right now. Maybe it's making some weird sounds or something. But, for whatever reason, he's thinking there's something happening in this closet. I want to see what it is. And so he gets up and he hobbles his way over to the closet. And then right as he's hearing more rustling inside, he turns the doorknob and he opens up this closet. At 5 p.m. that night, Michael's wife, Joan, walked through the parking garage at the federal courthouse and got into her car. She was feeling a bit unsettled because she had called Michael a couple of times that afternoon, but there had been no answer. And this was just really unlike him. In fact, this was so unusual that Joan had actually gotten in touch with her daughter, Meg, after the school day ended and asked her, have you been in touch with Dad? And Meg said that she hadn't. But she had gone home after school and she had grabbed some workout clothes in the house before leaving again. And she said when she was in the house, she had not seen her dad or, Joan's mom, so her grandmother, Donna. She said the house was quiet and I just assumed that Dad and Grandma were asleep upstairs or something. It took Joan about half an hour to drive home, and when she pulled into the driveway around 5:30 that night, it was getting dark. And so she pulls into her driveway, she gets out, she's still pretty anxious because she just hasn't heard from Michael or her mom at this point, and she goes up to the front door, she unlocks it, she steps inside, and right away she calls out for Michael. But there's no answer. She calls out for her mom. There's no answer. And so she walks around the first floor. Again, no sign of any issues here. Her husband and her mom are not around. She eventually makes her way upstairs, hoping to find them asleep in their beds, but she gets up there and she checks the bedrooms and all the rooms upstairs, and there's no one up there. And so the only place left to look in the house was the basement. But at this hour, it just made no sense that Michael or her mom would be in the basement. And so eventually, even though she felt really uneasy, she went back to the first floor. She went to the doorway that led down to the stairs into the basement, and she took a deep breath. She turned on the lights inside of the stairwell down to the basement, and she called out for Michael and her mom, but still no answer. And then down the stairs she went. And when she got to the base of the stairs, she looked down that hallway that led to Michael's office. And she saw, first, there was nothing. She didn't see anything, but on the floor, right outside of Michael's office, she saw what looked like blood on the ground. And so at this point, she panicked. She ran down the hallway. She's screaming for Michael. She grabs the door handle. She opens it up. And it's like everything she saw in there was so shocking. It was like her brain couldn't process it. And she just shut the door right away. Like she couldn't handle what she had just seen. And then a moment later, she had bolted back upstairs and called 911. In the late evening of February 28, 2005, Special Agent Douglas Seacombe of the Chicago FBI office ducked under the crime scene tape around the Lefkow family's home. So about 30 minutes earlier, the 911 call had come out of this home from Joan about what appeared to be a murder at this address. And since the caller, Joan, had identified herself as a federal judge, the Chicago police had immediately called the FBI to take part in this investigation. And so now, Special Agent Seacombe flashed his badge to one of the uniformed officers who was standing outside right near the edge of the crime scene tape. And he asked them, "Where is Judge Joan Lefkow?" And the officer said that Judge Joan, along with her daughters, so not just Meg, her teenage daughter, but also Joan's 3 adult daughters who no longer lived at home, they had all been taken together to a safe house by the U.S. Marshals. And so Seacombe, after hearing this, stepped inside the house, and he found a whole bunch of forensic teams already hard at work sweeping every room for evidence. And as he walked through the living room and the kitchen on the main floor, he didn't see any signs of blood or a struggle of any kind, and he also saw that, TV and other expensive-looking electronics were still in place, and so he didn't think this was a robbery gone wrong. Seacombe eventually found his way to the stairs that led down into the basement, and so down he went, and he found there were a few officers and a crime scene photographer that were down there gathered around a door that was at the end of the hallway. And so Seacombe made his way down the hallway, he pushed past the group of people, and there, inside of this home office, he saw 2 dead bodies. There was a man who was lying face down, and then right next to him was also an elderly woman who was lying face up, and there was just a big pool of blood underneath both of them. Seacombe immediately noticed that both the victims had fairly obvious gunshot wounds to their heads. And then when he knelt down to get a better look, he also found shell casings scattered around on the floor. So he figured that very likely these 2 clearly have been shot, but more specifically, they've been shot and killed in this room. On the other side of this office, Seacombe saw there was a closet and its doors were open, and it appeared to be a utility closet. And so Seacombe, he walked over and he stepped inside, and inside of it was this big furnace, and then next to it on the ground, he found there was a 12-pack of beer bottles, except one of the bottles was missing. And so Seacombe looked around inside the closet, he didn't see the 12th bottle, and then he turned around and looked back into the office. And as he's looking back into the office, he notices there's this window high up inside of the office, and it actually was out to the ground floor, because this is a basement, right? This is a window that leads to the first floor of the house, if you will. And there's like a cutout inside of the office, like a windowsill, almost like a ledge that is part of this window, right? So you could actually place things on this windowsill if you wanted to. And he looked up into this window and he saw there was a single beer bottle sitting on that windowsill, on that ledge. And also he saw the window itself was shattered. And so right away, Seacombe's thinking like, okay, did the killer leave behind this beer? And if so, why? Like, is this a message? Are they leaving the bottle here on purpose for us to find it? Or is this a mistake? And so Seacombe, he called for a forensics officer to come over and bag this additional bottle, the 12th bottle, and swab it for DNA and fingerprints in case, this was left by the killer. And so the forensics officer, he placed this bottle inside of a plastic bag, And then he asked Seacom to leave the office and head upstairs for a minute so that he and his team could spray the entire basement with a chemical called leucocrystal violet, which can illuminate traces of blood that are not necessarily visible to the naked eye. And so as Seacom left the office and began making his way upstairs, he began thinking about what he had just learned. So you have a broken window leading into the home office where it appears the shooting took place. And the fact that, the window was broken does suggest that's how the killer or killers got in. And if that's the case, it likely means the killer or killers did not know the victims personally. They didn't have a key to the house, for example, or they weren't going to be let in if they showed up at the front door. But then you have this weird beer bottle thing. Like if the killer left behind beer in that utility closet and this extra beer bottle up on the ledge of the window, that feels really sloppy. And so that's sort of at odds with the idea that this was like an intentional, outsider coming to do this hit. And then he's also thinking like, the elephant in the room here is that Joan, Judge Joan Lefkow, this is her husband and her mother. Was that intentional? Were they trying to sort of indirectly hurt Judge Joan? Or was Judge Joan the target? Or was this coincidence? When you are refreshing your space, choosing a paint color can feel weirdly high stakes. Will that seafoam green that you loved online look more like split pea soup on your walls? Luckily, Sherwin-Williams takes the guesswork out of finding the perfect paint color. With 3 easy ways to sample, you can choose color with confidence, testing shades in your actual space before making the final call. Order color chips, peel and stick, or color-to-go paint samples at swsamples.com or visit your neighborhood Sherwin-Williams store to get started today. An hour later, while forensics teams were still searching the crime scene, Seacom went out to canvass the neighborhood. The chemical spray that the forensics team had sprayed in the basement after Seacom had left had in fact revealed additional traces of blood all over the basement hallway. So it looked like at least one of the victims had actually been shot in the hallway and then moved into the office. And then the killer apparently had cleaned the hallway afterwards, but obviously this chemical had still revealed the blood traces. And so Seacom thought to himself that if the killer or killers stuck around to clean up after themselves, it suggests that they went into this home with the intention of committing murder. It was just a matter of why. Was it Joan the target? Was it her loved ones? Why did that happen? Who would want to harm the Lefkows? And so Seacom went down the street, knocking on doors and speaking to various neighbors, trying to get a feel for, what the Lefkows were like. But, after speaking to many people on the block who tried to be very helpful, Seacom really hadn't learned much of anything. Like, no one really had all that much to say. But eventually, Seacom found his way to a church that was in the neighborhood, and he knocked on the door. And a moment later, the pastor opened the door, and Seacom explained that, unfortunately, a double murder had taken place down the block, and they were here investigating. And have you seen or heard anything unusual in the past, several hours? And the pastor at first is just totally taken aback by what he's been told. He can't believe it. But then he's like, you know what? Actually, yeah, something strange did happen earlier today. The pastor said he had seen this red car just loitering nearby that had 2 men inside of it, and they were apparently smoking and drinking cans of what appeared to be Coca-Cola. But they just sort of didn't fit in with the neighborhood. Like the pastor didn't know who they were, and it just seems sort of odd that they were here. And so just considering what he's been told about this double murder, he basically said, you might want to look into who those guys were. And so Seacom asked the pastor if he'd gotten a good enough look at these 2 men to maybe be able to help their sketch artist come up with a composite sketch. And the pastor said, yeah, I think so. And so Seacom's like, okay, great, we're going to do that. But also, can you specifically point out where this car was, like outside, so I can go look at the area? And the pastor, he pointed across the street and he said, right over there. And so Seacom, he looks where the pastor is pointing, and sure enough, he could see on the ground there were all these cigarette butts and clearly an empty Coke can. And so Seacom called over a forensics team, and they scooped the stuff up and they sent it off to be tested. Later that same night, Seacom sat down at a table at the safe house where Joan and her daughters were all staying. And Joan, she walked over and set a glass of water in front of him, and then she sat down across from him. And Seacom thought Joan seemed surprisingly calm and composed, considering her husband and her mother have just been brutally murdered. But he also could sense that underneath the surface of Joan's sort of calm affect, she seemed furious. And so Seacom and Joan, they spoke a little bit about, this great tragedy and how awful this was. However, pretty quickly, Seacom just sort of got into asking pointed questions of Joan, and Joan answered them. Seacom asked Joan about the 12-pack of beer that was in the utility closet in the basement, and she told him it was left over from a party that they had thrown earlier that same week. And she said she was the one who actually put those beers in the closet, and when she did, she said they were all unopened. And this was great news for Seacom and the investigation, because that meant that the beer up on that windowsill in the basement almost certainly was handled by the killer or killers. But still, the idea of somebody breaking into this house and stumbling across some beer in the closet and stopping to actually have a drink right in the middle of committing a double murder and then leaving the beer bottle behind, it just felt like a really weird decision to make. And so Seacom wondered if maybe there was something at play here that literally prevented the killer from thinking clearly in the moment, like mental illness or maybe drug use. So at this point, Seacom had already come to the conclusion that very likely Donna, Joan's elderly mother, was not the intended target. She's 89, she doesn't have any known enemies, she's not hurting anyone, like she's not a target here. But perhaps Michael, Joan's husband, could have been the target. After all, at one point he'd actually run for Cook County judge a few years ago, and even though he had lost, entering politics was a surefire way to make enemies, so it was possible he could have been the target and Donna was collateral damage, but most likely of all still was that Joan was the one being targeted. Seacom knew that as a federal judge, there could be literally hundreds of people holding very serious grudges against her. And so Seacom told Joan that back at the command post, there was a team of detectives going through her entire docket and making a list of everyone who might have had a ruling that they were not happy with in the past few years. But maybe to help speed things along, he asked Joan if she could think of anybody off the top of her head who might have been responsible for this. And Joan, sort of without hesitation, said, yeah. In fact, there were 3 cases that came to mind. The first case was about a guy named Sean Peters, who was the leader of a local gang, and Joan had given him a very lengthy prison sentence, and so she said any of his fellow gang members, in theory, could have come after her in retaliation. The second case she brought up was about this armed robber whose name was Richard Young, and she said he just really scared her in the courtroom. Like he himself was just a very intimidating and sort of threatening person, and so he seemed capable of doing something like this. And she said the third case was about Matthew Hale. And before she even got into the explanation, Seacom recognized the name, because at the time, Hale was one of the most notorious white supremacists in all of Illinois. 6 years earlier, one of his followers had committed this horrible shooting spree that left 2 people dead and 9 others injured. Joan said that Hale had actually targeted her a couple of years ago in the wake of this trademark dispute. A church in Oregon with the same name as Hale's group had sued them, and Joan had actually enforced a ruling that forced Hale to change his group's name. Joan said that just the year before, Hale had actually been convicted of plotting to kill her over this issue. Joan said he was still in prison for those charges, so Seacom realized he could not have pulled the trigger himself, but clearly he had many followers who were willing to do things like this for him. The next day, so March 1st, Seacom sat down from notorious white supremacist Matthew Hale in a visiting room at the prison in Chicago where he was incarcerated. Hale was this very clean-cut, very stern-looking man in his mid-30s, and he didn't seem remotely rattled to be sitting across from an FBI agent who basically was insinuating that Hale was a potential suspect in a double homicide. And so Seacom told Hale about how Joan Lefkow's husband and her elderly mother had been brutally murdered inside of her home. And in response, Hale just laughed. He said that he and his followers had nothing to do with those murders. But, this was more or less what Seacom had expected Hale to say, because Hale was actually still awaiting sentencing for having tried to kill Joan. So of course he's not going to admit here to arranging another murder. He's going to say, no, I had nothing to do with it. Seacom told him that it really didn't matter if he denied this, because at this very moment, agents were seizing his phone and computer records, And if he had said anything at all about Joan Lefkow and her family to any of his followers, they would find out. But Hale, he just sat back and smiled and continued to insist that he's like, look, I really had nothing to do with this one. Like, nothing at all. You will find nothing. And Seacombe couldn't help but think that Hale seemed so calm and so confident that really deep down he thought to himself, maybe he's telling the truth. Later that same afternoon, Seacombe hunched over a desk in the corner of the Chicago Police Command Post. At this point, the police, the FBI, and the U.S. Marshals were all working on this case as part of a joint task force. And all the officers on the task force had moved their equipment into the police precinct so the investigation could be centralized. In a conference room to his left, Seacombe could see police officers comparing photos of Matthew Hale's followers to the composite sketches of the two men in the red car who the pastor had seen near the crime scene. And at a desk to Seacombe's right, there was another FBI agent who was listening to a recording of a phone call that Hale had recently made to his mother. The FBI at this point was taping all of Hale's phone calls in case he said anything incriminating. And meanwhile, other task force officers were sorting through this huge pile of letters that Hale had received in prison. However, after going through these letters, there was no mention of the Lefkows anywhere. However, at some point, Seacombe would join these other officers and continue to sort through all this mail in case something got missed. And as he was sorting through, months worth of mail, something actually did catch his attention. For months, Hale had been exchanging letters with this woman whose name was Kathleen Robertazzo. Basically every other day they were speaking. And Hale did not write to anybody else nearly that often, not even his own family. So this woman was clearly very important. Now, on the surface, nothing in these letters between Hale and Kathleen was incriminating. However, given the frequency of communication, Seacombe had to wonder if maybe these two could be talking in code. Like maybe they are talking about the Lefkows, but we just can't tell. The return address on these letters was for a suburb in Chicago, about 30 miles away from the prison where Hale was at. So Seacombe bundled up all the letters from Kathleen and stuck them inside of an envelope. He would need them as evidence to get a search warrant. The next evening, March 2nd, 2005, Special Agent Douglas Seacombe led a team of FBI agents up the driveway of a suburban home just outside of Chicago. And as they made their way up the driveway, they saw the car, parked there, was red, just like the car the pastor had seen outside the church that had been loitering near where Michael and Donna had been killed. Seacombe made his way up to the front door and he knocked. And then a moment later, a woman answered, and he said, "Are you Kathleen Robertazzo?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "Okay." And he held up a search warrant and he said, "We're here to search your house." And so Seacombe stayed outside with Kathleen while the other agents went inside and swept the whole house. And Kathleen seemed really annoyed by this whole thing, but definitely not that surprised. And so while the team was searching the home, Seacombe turned to Kathleen and asked her about her relationship with Matthew Hale. And he also asked her if she agreed with his, white supremacist views. And Kathleen admitted that, she did have a relationship with Matthew, but she corrected Seacombe and said, "I'm not a white supremacist, I'm a white separatist." Seacombe sighed and moved on to asking Kathleen about her whereabouts on the day of Michael and Donna's murders. And Kathleen insisted that she had nothing to do with that. She gave Seacombe her alibi for the whole day of February 28th, and while Seacombe was writing down the details on his notepad, the other agents came back out of the house carrying a computer. When Kathleen began complaining that she needed that computer for her work, Seacombe told her that they'd return it as soon as they searched it. And then before Seacombe put his notepad away, he looked down to the driveway and he looked at Kathleen's red car. And he remembered that he actually hadn't written down the license plate or the make or the model. But as he's looking at this car, he's realizing that there's no way this car matched the description of the pastor's red car that he had seen loitering outside of the church. Like, this was definitely not the same car that was suspected of being involved in the murder. 2 days later, on the evening of Friday, March 4th, so now 4 days after Michael and Donna were killed, Special Agent Seacombe carried a cup of coffee into a meeting room with the other officers on the task force, and he looked around the room and everybody just looked completely exhausted. It would turn out Kathleen's alibi had checked out, and her red car was definitely not the red car that had been spotted by the pastor, and there had been nothing on her computer that they had taken to search. So basically, she was cleared. And so Seacom and his fellow FBI agents, over the past couple of days, this is right after Kathleen was cleared, they had gone ahead and expanded their search and began interviewing more and more of Matthew Hale's followers. And a lot of them were very confrontational, and at least 3 people were detained for starting fights with the investigators. But one by one, their alibis began to check out, and so none of them were tied to Michael and Donna's murders, at least not yet. Now, a lot of Hale's followers had criminal records, so Seacom was hoping that maybe once fingerprint evidence came back from the crime lab, it would turn up a match. But deep down, realistically, Seacom was starting to doubt that anybody in Hale's circle was behind this. Additionally, the task force had investigated that gang leader Joan had mentioned, Sean Peters, as well as that armed robber, Richard Young, and they both also had been cleared as suspects. And so now, Seacom couldn't help but feel like, we're 4 days into this investigation, this pretty high-profile investigation, and it sort of seems like we really don't have much to show for it. Now, it was the case that there were still dozens of other people on Joan's court docket that maybe could have wanted to kill her that Joan was not aware of, but it was going to take time to keep sorting through all these people, and right now they didn't have traction in any one direction. It was like everything was sort of becoming a dead end. And so as Seacom is sitting in this room full of the other agents, and they're all sort of at a loss for what to do next, he was thinking to himself, is it possible that we've all just sort of wrongfully jumped to conclusions? We all basically assumed that this attack was, targeted at Joan. But Seacom's thinking to himself, he couldn't remember any other case where a judge's family was killed and not the judge themselves. Just then, Seacom's supervisor from the Chicago FBI office kicked off the meeting by announcing that the agency was putting up a $50,000 reward to the public for information on the murders. Now, the task force by this point had received over 200 tips, but the supervisor said, clearly that wasn't enough, and so we're going to use this reward to try to entice people who might have been too afraid to come forward. We'll pay them, and so hopefully this leads to better tips. The next Tuesday, so 9 days after Michael and Donna's murders, Seacom walked into the command post. The task force had been working all weekend, following up on hundreds and hundreds of calls that had come in since the reward money was announced. But it still didn't really seem like they were getting anywhere. And so Seacom, he sat down at his desk and he opened up a folder and he was about to get started when his cell phone rang. And he answered it, and it was the deputy director of the crime lab. And so Seacom's heart began to pound with anticipation as the deputy director told him that they had analyzed those fingerprints found on that beer bottle in the basement of the crime scene up in the window ledge, and after they had run it through the database, they had found a match. Based on forensic evidence and a confession from the killer, this is what police believe happened to Michael Lefkow and Donna Humphrey on February 28, 2005. Around 4:30 a.m., while everybody in the Lefkow house was still asleep, the killer smashed through that basement window and climbed down into the basement, and with them was a gun. Their plan was to hide in the utility closet all day, and then once everybody inside the house cleared out, they would leave the utility closet, sneak upstairs, and they would wait. And when the time was right, they would jump out, and they would ambush the person that they wanted to seek revenge on. But things did not go according to plan. Around 9 a.m., the killer was still in the closet when they heard footsteps coming downstairs, coming down the hallway and into the office where they were, and then they heard the sound of somebody sitting in that desk chair and papers shuffling around, and then a moment later, they heard the sound of footsteps as somebody approached the closet. And then before long, the closet doors opened and there was this man standing there looking really surprised. He was on crutches and he's looking at the killer, and the killer just panicked and they raised their gun and they shot this man point blank in the head, and he crumpled to the ground, and the killer's looking down and there's just blood going everywhere, and they're like, I can't believe what I've done. And then a moment later, the killer hears somebody calling out, Michael, is that you? And he looks down the hallway and he sees this elderly woman shuffling down the hallway looking really concerned, who clearly just heard the gunshot, and sort of in a continued state of panic, the killer rushed out of the closet, went down the hallway, raised the gun, and shot this woman in the head as well. And as Donna is bleeding all over the hallway, the killer put their gun away, reached down, scooped her up, and dragged her over into the office and sort of dropped her next to Michael. At this point, the killer's looking down at what they've done and they're thinking, well, At this point, I better make sure they really are dead, so they pull out their gun again, and they shoot Donna and Michael one more time, just to make sure they would not talk to anyone about what they had seen. After that, the killer went back into the utility closet, and their eyes landed on that pack of beer sitting on the floor, and they felt like that was exactly what they needed right now to calm their nerves. So they reached down and they pulled out one of those beers and they cracked it open and they took a sip while they thought about what their next move was going to be. And so as the killer is drinking this beer, they're thinking to themselves, well, I've just killed two people that I did not intend to kill. Those were not my targets. And so they felt kind of bad, like two basically innocent people had been murdered here. And so it made the killer think, like, should I still stick around and wait for my intended target? And eventually they decided, you know what, I need to change my plan. And so the killer, they set their beer bottle down on the windowsill. Then they went and found a sponge and some bleach, and they began to try to clean up all the blood in the hallway. But as they're doing this, they're realizing there's just so much blood out here. There's bodies and lots more blood in the office. Like, this is too much. Like, I can't possibly clean all this. And so finally, around 1:15 p.m., the killer just sort of was like, well, this is as good as I can do in terms of cleanup. I'm just gonna leave. And so they did. They left the house and they left behind that bottle in the windowsill that would have their DNA and fingerprints all over it. The killer was a man named Bart Ross, and his intended target was Joan Lefkow. But Bart was not like a hardened criminal. Bart was a cancer patient who had tried to sue his doctors after he lost part of his jaw during treatment. Ross had developed a vendetta against these doctors who had left him disfigured. And over the last few years, he'd become increasingly paranoid and detached from reality, and he ultimately blamed Joan Lefkow for dismissing his medical malpractice suit and preventing him from getting justice. And so Bart had put together this list of 25 doctors, lawyers, and judges he wanted to kill, and Joan just happened to be at the top of the list. But after going into her home with the intent to kill Joan, but actually just killing Michael and Donna, Ross was so shaken up by it that he gave up on attacking Joan and just left the scene. But he obviously left behind crucial clues that got him caught. Ross's fingerprints and DNA were found inside of Joan's home, not just on that beer bottle, but elsewhere in the house. However, his fingerprints and DNA were not found on those cigarette butts and the Coke can that was left on the curb where that suspicious red car had been parked. And also, Ross looked nothing like the composite sketches of those two men that were seen inside of that red car, so in the end, the investigators believed that the red car probably had nothing to do with the murders, and Ross simply acted alone. On March 9th, one day after the fingerprint results came back, Wisconsin police officers spotted Ross's van near a federal courthouse in Milwaukee. But as they approached his van, Ross fatally shot himself. However, inside of his van, police found a note confessing in detail to the murders of Michael Lefkow and Donna Humphrey. On the morning of Sunday, July 13th, 2003, 26-year-old Tabitha Bryant walked through the front door of her big white house in Penfield, New York, which was an upper-middle-class suburb of Rochester. Her husband, Kevin, and their two young sons followed her inside, and they were all dressed in their Sunday best because they had just come back from church. However, on this morning, Tabitha sort of felt like a fraud because she knew she was not really living a Christian lifestyle. So Tabitha was actually having an affair with a guy named Keith, and her husband Kevin, who was 45 and nearly 20 years her senior, he had recently found out about it and confronted her about it. Tabitha, during this confrontation, had promised Kevin that she would end the affair, and then she and Kevin had agreed that they really needed to work on their marriage together. But despite sort of coming to a kind of resolution, it was very obvious that Kevin was still very mad at her. And so Tabitha had been sleeping on the pull-out couch in the den ever since. Now, Tabitha watched as Kevin grabbed his briefcase off the kitchen counter, he kissed their two boys goodbye, and then he walked back out to his car. Tabitha was used to him disappearing to the office on the weekends. Kevin was a lawyer, and he worked basically all the time. And, they did depend on his salary, his big salary, to pay their mortgage and also finance their expensive lifestyle with vacations and lots of nights out. Now, despite Kevin's salary being so sizable, they had for a while tried to supplement his income by renting out a bedroom in their house to Tabitha's half-brother, Cyril Weinbrenner, and his girlfriend, Cassidy Green. However, that arrangement, despite it being profitable for the couple, had ultimately soured when Cyril, the half-brother, had begun using drugs inside of the house. And so Cyril and Cassidy had moved out 2 months earlier, but despite, the terms on which they left, the group, Cyril, Cassidy, Tabitha, Kevin, their family, they remained friends, and they would still actually spend time together on the weekends. It was just they were not able to live together. Now, Tabitha, she did like having that extra money coming in, but the truth was, having her whole house back to herself was ultimately a good thing. Like, she felt relieved in some ways. But also, there was a part of her that sort of missed having, her half-brother and Cassidy around. Especially when Kevin was, gone all the time working. Like, she just felt lonely. And also, on top of just being lonely, Tabitha often was the one saddled with childcare. They had a toddler and a 5-year-old, and, she was just sort of taking care of kids all the time, or sort of isolated. It was just exhausting. And now, as she watched Kevin back his car out of the driveway, she could tell today was going to be another long, exhausting, lonely day. That night, around 9 p.m., Tabitha was fast asleep on Kevin's bed with one of their sons when she felt somebody shaking her. And when she opened her eyes and looked up, she saw Kevin standing right over her. And he leaned down and he whispered to her that it was very late and that Tabitha should go to her bed out on the pull-out couch. And then he picked up their sleeping son and carried him off to the boys' bedroom without waiting for a response from Tabitha. As Tabitha got out of bed, she thought about just staying put and insisting on sleeping in the master bedroom that night. But, their kids were already asleep, and she also didn't want to risk getting into a fight with Kevin, especially at this hour, and waking everyone up. And so ultimately she decided against it and just left the bedroom and headed downstairs to the den. And then when she got there, Tabitha unfolded the pull-out couch and lay down, and she tried to fall asleep, but after tossing and turning for a while, she just pulled out her phone, and she pulled up the number for Keith, the guy she'd been having an affair with. As she did this, she reminded herself that she had promised to end things with Keith, but she was also feeling sort of desperate for someone to talk to, and Kevin was clearly very intentionally shutting her out, so after a moment, Tabitha hit the call button. Later that same night, around midnight, 911 operator Jacqueline Sanabria had just started her shift at the Monroe County Sheriff's Office when a call came in. Jacqueline answered it, and immediately this man's voice came over the line saying his wife had just been shot. And so right away, Jacqueline followed protocol, and as calm as she could, she asked the man, had he attempted CPR? And the man, in this eerily calm voice, said no, he hadn't. And the reason he gave was there was simply too much blood. At 1:45 a.m. on July 14th, 2003, so about 2 hours after that 911 call, Sergeant Paul Sienna of the Monroe County Sheriff's Department pulled up in front of a large white house with black shutters and an attached garage. There were a bunch of police cruisers and forensics vans that were already on the scene, and Sienna could see neighbors who were kind of coming outside, watching from their lawns and driveways, trying to figure out what was going on. Sienna had been very surprised when he had gotten the call from dispatch about a murder in Penfield, because Penfield was a really nice, safe area. In fact, there had not been a single murder there in more than 40 years. Now, he climbed out of his car and walked over to the front lawn where 3 deputies were interviewing this middle-aged man who looked like he might have just gotten out of bed. One of the deputies saw Sergeant Sienna, and so he ran over to him and began to brief him on what they knew. He explained to Sienna that the man they were speaking to was Kevin Bryant. He was the man who had called 911, and he was the husband of the victim, Tabitha Bryant. The deputy said that Tabitha and Kevin's 2 young sons had been inside the house at the time of the shooting, but their grandparents had picked them up a few minutes ago. The house itself had already been searched, and there were no signs of forced entry, but it was not hard to guess how the killer or killers got inside. The garage door had been left open, and then the door between the inside of the garage and the inside of the house had been left unlocked. So basically anybody off the street could have just waltzed into the house. Now, Sienna knew that in nice, safe neighborhoods like Penfield, It was not unusual for people to leave their doors and garage doors unlocked or even open. But at the same time, he did think it was a little unusual that it just so happened that on the night of the shooting, the house was unsecured. So he wasn't really sure what to make of that. At this point, Sienna glanced over at the husband, Kevin, and he saw Kevin suddenly bend over and start dry heaving. Now, Sienna definitely wanted to talk to Kevin, but really he needed to check out the crime scene first. And also considering how, Kevin did not appear to be ready to talk right now, he figured he should just go inside and have a look around. So he ducked under the police tape that was roping off the garage, and he made his way inside. Once inside the house, Sienna passed the kitchen and also a playroom, and they looked relatively normal. And then he got to the den, and there was nothing normal about the den. There was blood everywhere, on the walls, the floor, the ceiling, and there were all these forensic technicians that were inside of the den, furiously swabbing all over the room, trying to take samples of all this blood and also trying to photograph the entire scene. And in the middle of all this chaos happening in the den, Sienna saw the victim, Tabitha Bryant. She was laying on the pull-out couch bed. As Sienna walked over to the body to get a closer look, right away he saw this was not just a shooting, because Tabitha had, more than a dozen stab wounds to her chest and her neck. And then also right below her right eye, there was this small, clean hole that Sienna recognized as a gunshot wound. This was an excessive amount of violence, and it made Sienna think that this could have been a crime of passion. And the fact that Tabitha clearly had been sleeping on the pull-out couch in the den instead of in bed with her husband made Tabitha's husband, Kevin, Sienna's prime suspect. I saw something on CNBC about hiring that really stuck with me. So nearly half of hiring managers say that a candidate's enthusiasm matters the most. And that makes sense because you can teach skills, you can train someone how to do the job, but you can't really teach someone to care. And when someone actually wants to be there, you notice it right away. And ZipRecruiter has a new feature that quickly lets you see the most interested, qualified candidates first, so you meet the right people faster. And now you can try it for free at ziprecruiter.com/Ballen. ZipRecruiter's smart matching technology connects you with qualified candidates instantly, and candidates can tell you in their own words why they're interested in your job. No wonder ZipRecruiter is the #1 rated hiring site based on G2. Use ZipRecruiter and find enthusiastic talent fast. 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day. And again, now you can try it for free at ziprecruiter.com/Ballen. Again, that's ziprecruiter.com/Ballen. Meet your match on ZipRecruiter. At 8:40 a.m. on July 14th, 2003, so about 9 hours after Tabitha Bryant was killed, Sergeant Paul Sienna sat across from her husband, Kevin, at a diner in Rochester, New York. Now, normally, Sienna would conduct interviews like this at the sheriff's office, but he was starving after spending all night on his feet at the crime scene, and he also hoped that, this informal setting would hopefully get Kevin to be a bit more talkative. So Sienna was suspicious of Kevin, one, because he was the husband of the victim, and right away, in murder cases, spouses are regarded as early suspects, and then also just this unusually violent murder. I mean, the murder itself was rare in a town like this, but it was just so violent, so much gore and blood. It just sort of screamed, this is a personal attack. This is a crime of passion. Again, making Kevin seem sort of suspicious here. However, the physical evidence made it look like Kevin actually could not have done it. He didn't have any blood or defensive injuries on him, which would make sense if he was the killer. I mean, given how much blood was at the scene, there should be some on him. And Sienna had checked the sinks and showers at the house to see if maybe Kevin had gotten blood on himself but cleaned himself up before police arrived. But there was no sign that there had been blood in the drains. Plus, the police had spent all night searching the house for murder weapons, a gun and maybe a knife, and so far they hadn't found anything. Still though, Sienna was not ready to, outright dismiss Kevin as a suspect, and he was looking for any holes in Kevin's story at this point. As Kevin had already explained multiple times by this point, He said he had come home from work around 9 p.m. the night before. He said he took the trash out, and then he went right up to his bedroom to read, while Tabitha was asleep on the pull-out couch downstairs. But at around 11:30 p.m., Kevin said he had gotten a very strange phone call. He had answered, and it was a woman, and she had said hello, but then it was silent, and there was just static on the line. Kevin eventually had just hung up and said he thought it was just a wrong number. But then he said a little while later, just before midnight, he'd heard gunshots and screams. Kevin said at that point he got up and he ran to his kids' bedrooms first to make sure they were safe, and when he saw they were, then he went downstairs and he found Tabitha dead in the den. And so now Sienna, sitting across from Kevin in their booth, he asked him, do you have any idea who could have done this? And Kevin, he paused for a moment, and then when he spoke, his voice cracked, and he actually began to cry as he sort of choked out that his wife's death was his fault. Now, at first, Sienna thought, oh my goodness, is this guy about to confess? Did he kill her? Is he going to tell me that? But when he pressed Kevin to continue, what do you mean by that? Kevin very tearfully would say that, he thought he maybe was the one who had left the garage open when he had taken out the trash, and he suspected that that must have been how the killer or killers got inside. And then, sort of oddly, Kevin continued and basically began to lay out this whole theory for what might have happened that night, sort of unprompted. He's giving his opinion. Kevin said, as he saw it, a burglar must have driven by, saw their garage was open, and decided to rob the house. However, he said when they went inside the house to rob it, they must have been caught off guard when they saw Tabitha in the den. And she must have woken up, and there must have been some sort of confrontation, and the burglar or burglars must have panicked and killed her and then fled without even robbing the place. That's probably what happened. And Sergeant Sienna did not give off how he felt about, what Kevin was doing and what he was saying. He just sort of nodded thoughtfully, like he was considering his theory. However, in reality, Sienna had already considered the possibility of this being a burglary gone wrong, but the way Tabitha had actually been killed just felt way too personal to chalk it up to a random intruder. And also, again, nothing from the house had been stolen. So what Sienna really wanted to know from Kevin was, why was Tabitha sleeping on the couch and not up with you? And to Sienna's surprise, Kevin was actually really open about these problems in their marriage. He explained that Tabitha was young, 20 years younger than he was, and she wanted to go to clubs and see friends every night of the week, while he was, usually too busy and too tired for doing that kind of stuff, so she would do it alone. Kevin said that once he'd realized his marriage was actually in trouble because of this dynamic, he said he'd put a lot of effort in to try to fix it by taking Tabitha out more often. And he'd thought things were basically back on track until a few months ago when he'd found out that she was actually having an affair. He said he'd drawn up divorce papers and been on the verge of filing them, but Tabitha had ultimately promised that she would break off the affair, so he had decided to give her one more chance. As Kevin said this, Sienna watched him very closely, trying to gauge whether or not Kevin was lying. Kevin definitely seemed nervous as he was speaking, and he also kept tapping his foot and running his fingers through his hair. But there was a chance that was also just exhaustion and maybe some shock, lingering shock. Sienna checked his watch and saw it was almost 9 o'clock, and he knew Kevin by this point had been awake for about 24 hours. But Sienna didn't want to just let him off the hook right now, because if Kevin was guilty, if he really did kill his wife or had something to do with it, Sienna knew he might never get a better shot at a confession than right now. So he decided he would just push Kevin to his breaking point and see if he'd crack. 8 hours later, around 4 p.m., Sienna stared at Kevin from across an interview room at the Monroe County Sheriff's Office in downtown Rochester. Kevin was sort of slumped in his chair with his head buried in his hands, and he kept complaining about migraines. Now, Sienna was not surprised that Kevin might be feeling worn out right about now, because he'd been answering questions for the last 17 hours. And they'd covered everything from the details of Kevin and Tabitha's relationship to their extended families, including the fact that Tabitha's half-brother, Cyril, had lived with them for a few months earlier in the year and it had sort of ended badly. And by this point, Kevin had made it clear that he actually thought Keith Cromwell, the guy Tabitha had been cheating on him with, should be a suspect, and Sienna had to agree. However, what Sienna couldn't get over right now was just how angry Kevin sounded whenever he mentioned Keith. I mean, he was truly enraged. He clearly was not remotely over his wife's affair. And so now Sienna was trying to gauge if maybe Kevin was angry enough about this to have committed murder. And so Sienna decided he would push Kevin a little bit further and extend the interview, and he did this by suggesting that they go ahead and order dinner. And at that point, Kevin, who was totally mad, he jumped up out of his chair and he said that unless he was under arrest, he needed to go back to his kids. And Sienna did not have the evidence to hold Kevin, so he had no choice but to tell him that, of course, he was free to leave. And as Sienna watched a deputy escort Kevin out of the room, he felt a little disappointed that he had not managed to get a confession. But he had gotten some pretty promising leads. Primarily, there was Tabitha's half-brother, Cyril, who definitely sounded like he knew a lot about Kevin and Tabitha's relationship, and he could have some good insights. And also, Sienna was thinking, as soon as possible, he needed to speak to Keith, who was Tabitha's affair partner. At 10 a.m. the next morning, Sergeant Sienna sat across from a broad-shouldered, bald, middle-aged man in the living room of a small house outside of Rochester. This was Keith Cromwell, the man that Tabitha had been having an affair with, and he struck Sienna as being a pretty tough, intense guy. So Sienna was actually a bit taken aback when he asked Keith about his affair with Tabitha, and Keith just began to cry. It just seemed sort of uncharacteristic for the way he appeared, at least at first glance. But Keith quickly wiped his eyes and he apologized, and then he asked what exactly Sienna wanted to know. And Sienna told him to just, start at the beginning. So Keith explained that he was a machine operator at a local factory, and it was a really stressful job. So Keith would sometimes blow off steam by going to a nearby strip club. And it was at that strip club about 6 months earlier that he had met Tabitha Bryant. And this really caught Sienna off guard, and he immediately asked Keith, what was Tabitha doing there at the strip club? But Keith just shrugged and said Tabitha had a wild side. She was a regular there. Sienna was still sort of taken aback by this and really didn't know what to think of it, but he just told Keith to keep telling his story. And so Keith continued, and he explained how he and Tabitha had exchanged numbers that first night, and then started texting and calling, and how that eventually turned into regular meetups when Kevin was at work. He said by July, they were hanging out several times a week and speaking on the phone basically every day. And Keith said this continued right up until Tabitha's death. And here, Sienna had to stop Keith again, because Kevin had told Sienna that Tabitha and Keith, their affair was over. But here Keith was basically telling Sienna the opposite. And so when Sienna pressed him on it, Keith said that actually Tabitha had called him around 11 p.m. on Sunday night, only about an hour before she was killed. And so this timing just felt like way too big of a coincidence, and it made Sienna wonder if Keith was actually just trying to give himself an alibi. Except it was not a very good one, because Keith lived close enough to Tabitha and Kevin that after that last phone call at about 11 o'clock, he would have had time to hang up the phone and drive over to their house and commit the murder by midnight. So this really wasn't an alibi. So now Sienna realized he was in a tough spot here. Tabitha's affair really gave both Kevin and Keith strong motives to want to kill her. And so basically neither man could be ruled out. They were kind of like equally primary suspects at this point. And on top of that, the additional information that Tabitha had been a regular at a strip club just raised a lot of additional questions. He realized he really needed to speak to someone who really knew Tabitha. Five days later, on July 19, 2003, Sergeant Sienna stood inside of a cemetery at the back of a group of mourners and watched as Tabitha Bryant's casket was lowered into the ground. Sienna had come to Tabitha's funeral not only to pay his respects, but also because he was looking for her half-brother, Cyril, and he had two reasons he really wanted to speak to him. First of all, he thought Cyril might have some additional unique insights into Tabitha's various relationships. I mean, Cyril had lived with Tabitha and Kevin and their kids earlier that year, and Sienna had heard that Cyril and Tabitha were quite close, and so maybe she had shared some additional insights that he would know. But the second reason for wanting to speak to Cyril was recently, Sienna had also begun to look at Cyril as being maybe a potential suspect. So Sienna had spoken with a number of Tabitha's friends, and from those interviews, Sienna had learned that Cyril and his girlfriend Cassidy were also both regulars at that same strip club that Tabitha went to. And then on top of that, Sienna knew that, Cyril and Cassidy had been caught using drugs by Tabitha and Kevin, and that's why they had been booted from the house just a few months ago. And so who knows, there could be some bad blood there. And so this made Sienna wonder if Tabitha's murder might have had nothing to do with her affair, and everything to do with, very likely some fight that she had had with Cyril and Cassidy when she caught them and kicked them out. But now, as Sienna scanned the funeral crowd, he didn't see anybody who matched Cyril's description. And so when the service ended and all the mourners began making their way out to the parking lot, Sienna hustled over to Tabitha's mother, and he asked her, had Cyril attended the funeral? And she said that actually, no one had heard from Cyril since the night Tabitha was killed. And she said that she was really worried about him because Cyril's mental health was quite fragile. About a year earlier, he'd suffered a huge mental breakdown after the death of another sibling, which was why Tabitha had invited him to live with her in the first place. And so now Tabitha's mom was afraid that Cyril had spiraled again and might be in trouble. But as empathetic as Sienna was, ultimately, this information he was getting from the mother did not paint Cyril as like a guy in need of help. It painted Cyril as being really suspicious. And so as politely as he could, Sienna asked the mom if she had any idea of how he could go about trying to find Cyril, any way he could even begin that process. And Tabitha's mom, she thought for a moment and then said that if anyone knew where Cyril was, it was his girlfriend, Cassidy Green. One night, about a week after Tabitha's funeral, Sergeant Sienna sat in the back of an unmarked van in downtown Rochester. And through the windshield, he watched a man standing alone in an alley, pacing back and forth, constantly checking his phone. This was all part of a sting operation that Sienna hoped would finally lead him to Tabitha's half-brother Cyril. Ever since Tabitha's funeral, he and his fellow deputies have been trying to track Cyril down, but so far they'd had no luck. It looked an awful lot like Cyril had either left town or was actively hiding from the police. However, Sienna had managed to locate Cyril's girlfriend, Cassidy, who, it would turn out, was well known to the police for being a drug dealer and an escort, who went by the working name of Angel. Now, Sienna doubted that if he approached Cassidy directly, that she would just immediately give up Cyril's location willingly. And so what he needed to do was get leverage on her first. So Sienna went to an informant of his with a plan. The informant would reach out to Cassidy, or Angel, looking to buy some cocaine, and then once they had clear evidence that she had broken the law by selling these drugs, Sienna would arrest her and then try to strike a deal to get her to talk about Cyril. And so now, through a pair of binoculars, Sergeant Sienna watched as a small blonde woman appeared at the far end of the alley. His heartbeat picked up as he realized it was definitely Cassidy, and he watched as she walked right up the alley and began talking to the informant, the man who had been pacing before on his phone. And when Sienna saw the money and drugs change hands, he gave the command on his radio to go ahead and move in. In an instant, 2 police cars rounded the corner with their sirens blaring, cutting off both ends of the alley. Cassidy looked completely startled and started to run before the arriving deputies boxed her in, and moments later, they had her in handcuffs. The following morning, Sienna stood outside of an interview room at the sheriff's office in Rochester, New York. He looked through a 2-way mirror, and on the other side of the glass, he watched a deputy question Cassidy, the girlfriend of Tabitha's half-brother Cyril, who was still missing and still a major suspect. Now, Cassidy had been completely stonewalling police since they'd arrested her for selling cocaine the night before, and she was still insisting that she had no idea where Cyril was or why he'd disappeared. Now, to this point, the deputy who was speaking to Cassidy had not brought up Tabitha's murder. And so at this point, Cassidy seemed to think that her only problem was the cocaine charge. And so as Sienna watched this interview just kind of go in circles and drag because Cassidy just was not giving them anything, finally Sienna just couldn't take it anymore, and he just busted in the room and he slammed a folder down right on the table, totally shocking not just the deputy, but Cassidy. They both looked at him like, "What are you doing?" And then before Cassidy could say or do anything, Sienna looked right at her and just said, "I don't care about your drug charge. What I want to know is what you know about Tabitha Bryant's murder." And at first, Cassidy just stared back at Sienna and said nothing. And for a minute, Sienna thought maybe he had sort of miscalculated here. But then after a long, awkward pause, Cassidy's whole demeanor shifted and she started to talk. Based on witness testimony, evidence collected at the crime scene, and the killer's eventual confession, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Tabitha Bryant on the night of July 13th, 2003. Around 11:50 p.m., the killer very carefully crept through the first floor of the Bryant home carrying a rifle, and they went straight to the den where they found Tabitha asleep on the pull-out couch. For a moment, the killer paused, just staring down at Tabitha, wondering, questioning whether they could really go through with this. But then, after just a little bit of deliberation in their own minds, they raised the rifle and they fired. The bullet entered Tabitha's skull right under her right eye, but it didn't kill her. And so as the killer is standing there watching, expecting Tabitha to basically be motionless, Tabitha wasn't. Her body began jerking around, and then she suddenly reached up and grabbed at her cheek, and she sat up and she looked at the killer and began to scream. And so the killer immediately fired 2 more times, but Tabitha was moving around so much in her own panic that both shots missed. And then on the 4th shot, when the killer pulled the trigger for the 4th time, the rifle jammed. And so at this point, the killer completely panicked. And so the killer turns and they run into the kitchen. All the while, Tabitha is flailing around in the den. She's screaming, blood's going everywhere. And the killer, they grab a butcher's knife from the kitchen. They run back into the den. And when they get there, they see Tabitha is now standing. And she's clutching at her face. She's screaming. And the killer tackles her back onto the bed and begins stabbing her over and over again in the neck and the chest until she does finally go limp. When the killer climbed off of Tabitha and stood back up, they realized they, like the rest of the room, were covered in blood. And so the killer began just sort of backing away from the scene, not really sure what they were going to do. And as they're doing this, they hear a noise behind them, and they whip around, and they see there was a figure coming down the stairs. And when this figure got to the bottom of the stairs, they walked right up to the killer and handed them an envelope. And the killer took the envelope, blood all over them. They take the envelope, they open it up, they look inside to confirm that yes, it was stuffed with $100 bills. It would turn out the person who actually wielded the rifle and the knife and literally killed Tabitha was her half-brother Cyril. He got covered in blood so that the real mastermind, Tabitha's husband, Kevin, could keep his hands clean. Kevin paid Cyril and his girlfriend Cassidy $5,000 to do his dirty work for him. Cyril committed the murder, and Cassidy drove the getaway car. But long before they got to the house that night, Kevin was setting things up so that the murder would go according to his plan. Kevin opened the garage and unlocked the door to the house so that Cyril could come inside no problem. And when he found Tabitha in their bed upstairs, he woke her up and told her to head on down to the den, where he knew Cyril would look for her. Kevin was motivated by anger over Tabitha's affair with Keith, and also the fear that he would lose his kids if they got divorced. But ironically, it was actually Kevin's own actions that drove Tabitha, literally, into Keith's arms. Kevin portrayed himself as this, hardworking lawyer who basically was a workaholic, and all he did was provide for his family. But in reality, he was a drug and sex addict who routinely brought sex workers to his law office. His idea of working on his marriage, as he said he and Tabitha were doing after he discovered her affair, really just involved taking Tabitha to strip clubs and then pressuring her into having group sex with other sex workers. And then he would also pressure her to give lap dances to the other clientele. And one of those other clientele was Keith. That's how they met. Kevin and Cyril were both convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. As for Cassidy, she ultimately took a plea deal and received 15 years. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. On the evening of May 25th, 2023, a student named Jung Yoo-jung sat at her desk in her bedroom inside the house where she lived with her grandfather in Busan, which is the second largest city in South Korea. Jung was hunched over with her head in a book, studying for a really important test that she had coming up. But the words on the page just kind of jumbled together and she couldn't focus. And, Jung just felt really frustrated because she knew she needed to consume this material and internalize it, but the way she was doing it clearly wasn't working. She really needed help. However, Jung had previously tried to find a tutor, to get help, but finding the right tutor had proven to be very challenging. So Jung had recently signed up for this mobile app that was supposed to connect high school students to tutors. And she had reached out to over 50 people, asking them if they could help her prepare for this really major exam in her 9th grade English class. But everyone she had spoken to either was not available or just wasn't a good fit. But on this night, as Jung stared down at her book, desperately trying to parse through the words on the page, she suddenly heard her phone buzz. And so Jung, who was sort of eager for a distraction here, she grabbed her phone and she saw there was a notification from that mobile app, the tutoring app. So Jung, she opened up the app and she read the message and she broke into a smile because the reply was from a potential tutor that she'd contacted earlier that day that she had been, sort of optimistic about. According to this tutor's profile, her name was Chae-eun. She was a 26-year-old college student and she spoke fluent English. And now, in her reply, Chae-eun told Jung that she would be more than happy to help her and was actually available to start as soon as the day after tomorrow. There was just one downside. Chae-eun tutored exclusively out of her own apartment, which was on the far north side of the city. So it would be pretty inconvenient for Jung to just get there. And then also she knew her grandfather would definitely worry about her traveling that far alone. But after having searched for a tutor for so long with no success, Jung just did not want to pass up this opportunity. So she immediately messaged back that she couldn't wait to get started. And then she and Chae-eun set up their first meeting. 2 days later, on the evening of May 27th, Jung walked up to the tutor's apartment complex. It had taken her almost an hour to get here on the bus. And she'd been lugging, this huge bag with her full of her study materials the whole time. She had brought along basically all of her stuff, just in case they actually got to studying today, which realistically Jung didn't know if they would. This is their first meeting. She didn't really know what to expect. But either way, Jung was glad to be here. This represented progress. So Jung, along with her big old bag, went up to the door with the apartment number that Chae-eun had given her, and she knocked. A few seconds later, the door swung open, and Jung saw Chae-eun standing there with a big smile on her face, and she looked exactly like she did in her profile picture on the app. Chae-eun then introduced herself and shook Jung's hand and welcomed her inside. Jung walked in and had a quick look around, and she saw the apartment was pretty small. It was a studio apartment. There was a bed and a couch in the same main area, and there was a kitchen and bathroom sort of branching off from there. Just then, Jung heard Chae-eun shut the door, and then she walked right past Jung and she took a seat on the couch, and then she sort of beckoned Jung to come have a seat next to her and come chat. And so Jung, she smiled and she's got her bag and she walks over and she sits down next to Chae-eun, and the pair just start chatting. And, Chae-eun asks her to explain again, sort of what are your main goals here? What can I help you with? And Jung said, well, I have this big test coming up for my English class, and, I was hoping you could help me with that. And Chae-eun said, yeah, of course I can. I'm fluent in English. I've worked with many people on, similar testing material. So, this is going to be great. And so Jung, she's thrilled, and she says to her tutor, well, hey, I brought my stuff. Can we just start the lesson right now? And Chae-eun was sort of maybe taken a little bit aback. This is their first interaction, but she's like, okay, yeah, let me just get a drink of water first. And so Chae-eun, she wanders off into the kitchen and disappears to get her water, and Jung unzips her bag and begins fishing out her studying materials. A few hours later, a taxi driver was driving through the northern part of Busan, scanning the sidewalk for potential customers. And at some point, as he looked around, he eventually saw this woman, who appeared to be maybe in her 20s, standing outside of an apartment complex, Chae-eun's apartment complex. And this woman, she had this large, very heavy-looking black suitcase by her side, and she was waving to the cab driver, clearly trying to hail him down. So the driver pulled up alongside the curb, he rolled down his window and he called out to her and asked where she needed to go. And the woman told him that she needed to go to the Nakdong River. And this immediately struck the driver as being a little weird, because the Nakdong River was in a very isolated area far outside the city. It was like a really odd place for a young woman to go alone, especially this late at night. But the driver also knew that he could charge the woman a pretty high fare for taking her all that way. So he said, okay. Then he popped the trunk of his cab and asked if she needed help with her suitcase. But she immediately said no, she had it. So the driver just shrugged, and he waited while this woman lugged this heavy suitcase to the back of his cab, and she hoisted it into the trunk, she shut the trunk, and then she climbed inside. And then the driver pulled away from the curb and started heading out of the city. And it was a long, quiet ride, but eventually he pulled up to the entry point for Nakdong River, which was basically a trailhead surrounded by bushes that led into this sort of semi-forested area. At this point, the driver parked, and the woman asked him how much she owed him, and he told her, and so she pulled out her money and she quickly paid him. And then, just out of habit, the driver asked the woman again if she needed help getting her suitcase out of the cab. But again, the woman very quickly said no, she didn't. She would handle it on her own, but thank you. So again, the driver just shrugged and popped the trunk. And then he waited as this woman got out and pulled the suitcase out of the back. Now, at this point, the driver knew, his job is done here. It's not his business what she's doing here. But, it's almost midnight, and he couldn't help but feel sort of concerned about dropping this woman off here, basically in the middle of nowhere so late at night. And he just wanted to make sure that she was okay. So instead of just driving away, he just continued to watch as she walked towards the trailhead. And as he watched her, he noticed that she was really struggling to move her suitcase. I mean, it looked like it was so heavy that she could barely drag it through the dirt. And it was at this point that the driver couldn't help but feel like something's off here. This is not typical behavior. Everything about this just feels weird. What's going on? So, because he had this sort of gut feeling that something was off with this lady, instead of just leaving altogether and continuing his night, he just drove a little ways away from where he dropped her off and then stopped. And he turned and he just watched the trailhead to see if the woman would come back out or if anybody else would show up. And so he just continued to watch and nothing happened for a while. But after about 20 minutes, he saw some movement, and out of the woods comes this woman. And she still has this suitcase, but now it's plainly obvious that the suitcase is empty, or whatever was really heavy inside of the suitcase has been removed, because she's moving the suitcase no problem, whereas before, she could barely get it through the dirt. And the driver, he couldn't help but think, what was in that suitcase? Because clearly, she has come here to dump it somewhere out in this very isolated part of this area. This just feels really bad. I don't even want to know what she's doing. Somebody needs to investigate this, though. This just feels wrong. And so he turned around, he started driving away, he pulled out his phone, and he called the police. A few minutes later, the woman with the suitcase stood at the trailhead, hoping that another taxi might pass by soon and she could hitch a ride home. And at some point, she saw headlights approaching in the darkness, and for a second, she felt really hopeful, and she waved her hand hey, I need a ride. But when the vehicle finally pulled up, she saw that it was not a taxi, it was a police cruiser. And this cruiser came to a stop right next to her, and then an officer stepped out of the car and asked her what she was doing out here so late. And in a very calm voice, the young woman just said she had come out here to drop off some trash because the dumpster at her apartment complex was full. But the officer didn't really seem to be listening to her. He was actually just staring at her big black suitcase. And he actually just asked her, "Can I see what's inside of that?" And this made the woman very nervous. But she also knew that the best thing she could do right now was just continue to stay calm and cooperate. So she nodded and said, "Sure, have a look." And so the officer walked up and he unzipped the suitcase and he flipped it open and he shined his flashlight inside. And it was empty, but it was covered in blood. The blood had soaked into the lining all across the inside of the suitcase. But the woman knew this was going to happen. I mean, she knew what was in there, and she'd prepared for this. She told the officer that she was simply on her period, and the blood he was seeing was nothing more than menstrual blood. But the look on the officer's face made it very clear that he did not believe anything she was saying. And at that moment, the woman's world came crashing down, because she knew that despite all the months of studying she had done, she had just failed her test. It would turn out that Jung Yoo-jung was not a 9th grade student studying for an English exam. She was actually a 23-year-old woman masquerading as a high schooler. And her very important test was one she had actually created for herself. She wanted to see if she could commit the perfect murder. She had spent months obsessively studying true crime books and documentaries, coming up with what she thought was a foolproof murder plan. And so after coming up with this plan, she posed as a 9th grader and hired a private tutor, Chae-eun. But when she went to Chae-eun's apartment, she wasn't carrying books in a backpack. She was carrying a knife inside of a suitcase. After Jung told Chae-eun that she wanted to start her lesson, Chae-eun got up, she went into the kitchen, she got some water, and when she came back, Jung had gotten out her knife, and she proceeded to stab Chae-eun to death. And then after that, she dismembered Chae-eun's body, put the pieces inside of that suitcase, and then Jung attempted to dispose of the body in the woods by the Nakdong River. But her foolproof plan did not work, because she was ultimately arrested before she even made it home that night. Jung Yoo-jung was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Everyday life is full of moments that you plan for, and also moments that just happen, often when you least expect them. Whether it's part of your normal routine or something unexpected, Amazon is where you go for everyday essentials, making shopping simple and dependable. From running out of household basics to last-minute surprises, Amazon's great deals and low prices on everyday essentials make it easier to handle whatever life throws your way. Everything is in one place, so there's no extra stress or jumping through hoops when time is already tight. Whether it's something you buy regularly or something you suddenly realize you need right now, Amazon makes it easy to find what you're looking for quickly and at a price that feels good. It's straightforward, dependable shopping that makes everyday moments feel more manageable with less stress, fewer steps, and more confidence that your money is well spent. Shop Amazon and save on essentials. Save the everyday. On the evening of January 31st, 2012, a 72-year-old retired high school teacher named Norm Johnson was playing the piano in his home in the tiny town of Madison, South Dakota, when his doorbell rang. And Norm was surprised. I mean, not because, just somebody had shown up at his house. I mean, the reality is getting unannounced visitors was not totally unusual in his household. But tonight in particular, it was odd, because the Madison High School basketball team had a big game that night, and pretty much the whole town was there cheering them on. Like, who isn't at the game ringing my doorbell right now? Who would that be? Now, usually Norm would be at the basketball game too. Not only had he coached several sports at the high school during the years he had taught there, but also he had grown up in Madison and he had gone to the high school and he had played on the football team and been on the track team. And, those had really been, in some ways, some of the best years of his life. And I mean, even now as an adult, he still had such strong feelings and such a strong affinity for Madison High. It was like a home away from home. But despite all that, Norm had chosen not to go to the game tonight because he had just had a long day of meetings for the local boards that he volunteered on, and just in general, he felt like he just needed some time home to relax. And so before he got up, Norm called out to his wife, Barb, who was in their kitchen, and he just asked, hey, do you have any idea who's at the door right now? And she yelled back, no, I have no idea. So Norm got up from the piano and went to the door to answer it. When he opened the door, he saw a very unassuming man with gray hair and a beard who was standing out on the doorstep. Norm didn't know who this guy was, which was also just kind of odd, because again, Madison is like a really small town, pretty much everybody knew each other. But before Norm could ask him who he was or what he wanted, this guy asked Norm, "Are you Norm Johnson?" And Norm said, "Yeah." And then, without another word, the man raised a pistol he was holding and he fired. An hour later, Madison Police Sergeant Justin Meyer parked his car outside of a little brown house that was now cordoned off with crime scene tape. Meyer had been totally shocked when the dispatcher had called him to tell him what had happened here, both because there hadn't been a murder in Madison in almost 100 years, and because Sergeant Meyer knew the victim, Norm Johnson. And so now, Meyer walked up to the house and stepped over a huge puddle of blood right inside the front door, And then he found Norm's wife, Barb, sitting on the couch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. I mean, she looked like she was clearly in shock. Around Barb on the walls were all these old photos of her and Norm. And some of these photos clearly dated back to the 1950s when they had been high school sweethearts. Norm had been the star running back on the football team, and Barb had been a cheerleader. Meyer took a deep breath, and then he walked over and sat down next to Barb, and he asked her what happened. And she just said she didn't know. She didn't understand. She said that Norm had just gone to answer the door, and then seconds later, she heard what sounded like 2 gunshots. And then, as Barb sort of choked back tears, she said that she had run over and she had found Norm lying on the floor with blood pouring out of his face. And through the doorway, she happened to see this gray-haired man that she didn't recognize, calmly just walking away down their walkway towards his car, and then he just drove off. And Sergeant Meyer, when he heard this, I mean, he really couldn't believe it. I mean, in many ways, he was just as baffled as Barb was about how in the world something like that could have happened, especially in this town. Like, what Barb was describing sounded like a premeditated hit, like an assassination. But Meyer just couldn't imagine who would want to do that to Norm. Like, Norm was beloved by the whole community, and he had been for decades. And so eventually, Meyer left the house and began to speak to all the neighbors. But, as he discovered, pretty much none of them were home at the time of the shooting because they were all out at that basketball game. And then also Meyer discovered that nobody in the area had security cameras outside their houses. And so nobody had captured any images or video of the crime. Because after all, I mean, Madison was typically a very safe area. And so by the time Meyer went home for the night, he was already starting to worry that he might not be able to solve this. However, the very next morning, Meyer got a call from a tipster. And this tipster said that there actually was one person in the area who definitely had a problem with Norm. That was a 73-year-old man named Carl Erickson. And at first, when Meyer began asking some basic follow-up questions, he just couldn't understand how this Carl guy could even be a suspect. I mean, he lived over an hour away in a different town. He was like a retired insurance officer with no criminal record. Like, how in the world would he be the guy that's, assassinating Norm? That just didn't make any sense. There was no clear connection. And then also there was just the fact that as people, they couldn't have been more different. Like, they definitely would not have overlapped in society. You have Norm, who's like very outgoing and social and beloved, and you have Carl, who's totally a loner, keeps to himself, and for the most part was kind of rude and just people didn't really like him. So like, there's just no reason that these two would come together. But Meyer had very little to go on here, and so he needed to follow up on any lead he really got. So that evening, he brought Carl in for questioning. And very quickly he realized that actually, Norm and Carl do have one thing in common. It would turn out Carl and Norm had gone to the same high school. Carl had grown up in Madison before he moved away. And the past 50 years of both of their lives had largely been defined by who they were as teenagers in high school. But while high school had been Norm's glory days, Carl had a very different experience. He had been an outcast who basically, at best, nobody really paid attention to. And so while Norm is like the star of the football team dating the cheerleader, Carl had actually served as the football team's student manager, who basically ran errands for the coach and assisted from the sidelines. Deep down, Carl was deeply jealous of Norm specifically. I mean, he was popular, he's this jock, he's got all the things that he wanted but really couldn't achieve. And then one fateful day in the locker room after a practice, someone had come up behind Carl and put a jockstrap on his head as a kind of awful prank. And, Carl was not totally sure who did it, but over time, he became convinced it was Norm. Now, over time, the people who were involved in that prank, the football players, they just kind of forgot about it. And in fact, many of them sort of forgot about Carl himself. But Carl never forgot the humiliation. He stewed about it for more than 50 years before his anger finally boiled over and he decided it was time to get his revenge. So on January 31st, 2012, he drove to Norm's home and he shot him in the face. A few months later, Carl pled guilty to second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. On the afternoon of August 10, 2011, Detective Inspector John Finch of the London Metropolitan Police walked through the courtyard of the Radisson Edwardian Hotel in London. This was a massive luxury hotel with more than 400 rooms. Finch navigated past the beautiful greenery and the koi ponds and the multiple restaurants until he found the door he was looking for, which was roped off by crime scene tape with a uniformed officer standing in front of it. Through the doorway, Finch could see there were forensic technicians taking photographs and putting down evidence markers. This was a section of the hotel where members of the staff lived in small apartments, and the police had been called here by hotel management because the bodies of 2 workers had been discovered inside, and a 3rd worker was missing. Finch had already been briefed on the basics. The 2 dead were a woman named Alice Adams, who was 20, and a man named Tibor Vass, who was also age 20. And they both had been at the same party in the apartment they were found in the night before. Tibor actually lived in this apartment, and it was actually his roommate, a 31-year-old man named Attila Ban, who was the missing 3rd worker. And this was basically all the police knew at this point. They didn't even have a theory yet on whether the missing Attila was another victim or the killer. They really just didn't know. And so now, Finch greeted the officer who was at the door and introduced himself and showed his credentials, and then he ducked under the crime scene tape. And before long, he found himself standing in this small living room type area where the first victim, Alice, was lying in this massive pool of blood on the carpet. She was wearing a shirt, but no pants, but she did have underwear on, and she had a couch cushion that was placed over her face, and there were stab wounds all over her body. One of the forensics techs warned Finch to be careful where he stepped because there was so much blood all over the floor, they didn't want Finch to step in it. So very carefully, Finch moved around the outside of the room and made his way into the kitchenette, where another forensics tech was picking up items one by one and dusting them for fingerprints and then setting them back down exactly where they were. And among sort of all the items scattered about the kitchenette, Finch noticed there were lots of pill and alcohol bottles. And so now he began to formulate his first theory, that this party they had all been to the night before had gotten way out of hand, and Alice had been attacked in a sudden rage by somebody who very likely knew her. Her missing pants suggested a possible sexual element, and the sheer number of stab wounds on her body and the amount of blood spatter really did suggest the killer was in some sort of a frenzy. The cushion that was found over Alice's face suggested that after the killer had sort of calmed down after the murder, maybe they had felt guilty and couldn't bear to look at what they had done, and so they covered her up. To Finch, this basically felt like a substance-fueled crime of passion. However, when he stepped into the bedroom, the scene inside of there told a totally different story. On the bed was Tibor Vass, the second victim, and he was completely naked, and he had been very carefully posed in this strange position where he was on his back and his knees were bent. It was immediately obvious to Finch that Tibor had not been killed here on this bed. There was only a tiny bit of blood on the sheets, and Tibor's body itself was perfectly clean, like it had been washed, before being arranged on the mattress. And then, when Finch walked over to get a better look at Tibor's body, he saw that the man's injuries were much neater than Alice's. Tibor only had 2 stab wounds, at least that Finch could see, and both of them were directly to his heart. So this was a very efficient murder. And so after a minute or two, Finch sort of backed up and just found himself feeling really confused, because even though he was in one crime scene, there are 2 victims, 1 crime, it almost felt like it was 2 totally different crimes. Like the murder that took place out there with Alice had been messy and very impulsive seeming, and possibly was because the murderer was, heavily intoxicated. And then this murder of Tibor, it seemed like it was committed by somebody who was much more methodical and potentially even sober. And so Finch couldn't help but wonder, how does this missing roommate, Attila Ban, fit into this picture? Because clearly, that's the piece that seems to be missing and likely would sort of answer all of his questions. And so at this point, what Finch decided he would do is he would go track down the other hotel workers who had been at this party the night before, to see if they knew where Attila was or what happened to Attila or why any of this happened. They were there, maybe they knew something. And so Finch, he turned around and he left the bedroom and he very carefully navigated back across the living room, being careful not to step in any blood. and then he left the apartment, and as he did, he sort of noticed something strange. But right now he knew the most important thing was going and speaking to those other workers to see what they knew. And so for now, he sort of forgot this strange element he thinks he's discovered, put it over here, and just said, I'll deal with that later. And off he went to go find the other workers. Over the next few hours, Finch spoke to a whole bunch of hotel workers, and they were able to tell him a lot about Alice, Tibor, and Attila. Basically, they were all good friends, they all worked together, and they were known for being very responsible and very hardworking. Alice apparently had only just begun working at the hotel a few weeks ago, and coworkers said that she and Tibor seemed to have some chemistry, but no one was sure whether their relationship went beyond a platonic friendship, because Alice actually did have a boyfriend. And Tibor's roommate, Attila, the one who was missing, was apparently a hotel manager, and recently he'd been named Employee of the Year, and everybody seemed to really love working with him. Finch also learned more about the party that Tibor and Attila had hosted in their apartment the night before, during which the murders, must have happened. And apparently, it was really just a small gathering to celebrate Tibor getting into college, and the only people in attendance were Tibor, Attila, Alice, and then 2 other coworkers. Finch had interviewed those 2 other coworkers, and they would say that, during this party, this gathering, everybody had been drinking really heavily. But they insisted that it was a calm night without any conflicts or fights. And they both said that when they left the party, Alice and Tibor and Attila were all alive, awake, and totally fine. And so this information certainly seemed to suggest that Attila did it. I mean, he was the most obvious one that could have committed these murders. The 3 were left alone, 2 wind up dead, the 3rd is missing, Attila. But Attila, despite the fact he was missing, which did sort of make him very suspicious, beyond that, he was like this unbelievably sweet guy who had no problems with anyone. He was like the Employee of the Year. Like, it just didn't track. Nobody thought Attila could have done this. Nobody. The fact that Alice had a boyfriend, but apparently was, getting close to Tibor and, sort of going beyond being just platonic, that was intriguing to Finch. Coworkers said Alice, flirted with Tibor a lot, and Finch thought it was definitely possible that maybe the boyfriend had come to the apartment and found Alice and Tibor together being sort of inappropriate and killed them out of jealousy. It felt like a very possible theory. However, that would explain why Alice's body was in the state it was in, but that theory would not explain why Tibor's body had been posed in such a bizarre way, or also what happened to Attila, like where's Attila? Now, Finch knew that all day his team had been pulling surveillance video from around the hotel. So in the evening, around 7 p.m., he went back to the station to start combing through the footage. He wanted to get his eyes on every single person who entered and left the employee housing area on the night of the killings. The hotel really was covered in cameras, and odds were the killer would be somewhere on those tapes. But later that night, when Finch finally got to the end of all the footage he was given, he was baffled. So the surveillance video didn't actually show the doorway to Tibor and Attila's apartment. It just showed the area around the building that contained the apartment. So Finch could only see who entered and left the building, not the individual apartment. So that was a limitation. But he could see Tibor and Attila and Alice and those other 2 party guests enter the building before the party, and he could see those same 2 party guests leave hours later, at almost the exact time they had told him they left. There was no sign of Alice's boyfriend at all, which meant he very likely was not the killer. Otherwise, you'd see him somewhere on this tape, and he just was not there. And so as disappointing as that was, it, made sense, and it at least sort of progressed the case. But Finch is also thinking, like, the thing the footage also doesn't show is what happened to Attila. Where is Attila? On the morning of August 12th, so 2 days after the bodies were found, Detective Finch went back to the apartment, now with his team of detectives. Attila, at this point, was still missing. Nobody knew what happened to him. And that was actually why Finch was back here with his team. He wanted to take a second look around, not just the building and the apartment, but really the whole area. Because they had traced Attila's phone, and it was pinging off a cell tower right next to the hotel, as if he was like still here. But, keep in mind, by this point, police have searched The whole grounds, including every room, all the closets, all the utility areas, they've looked everywhere on this property and they have not found a trace of him. But Finch thinks, what else can I do but just keep on looking? So now, Finch and his team greeted the officer, who was still standing guard by the crime scene door, and the officer let Finch and the other investigators in. And pretty much the second Finch stepped back inside this apartment now for the second time, he knew something was off. Finch had been staring at crime scene photos for the past 2 days obsessively, and as a result, he really had a good feel for how this place had been left. Because remember, when they take photos and when they, dust for prints and all that, they try to leave the scene exactly the way it is because it's all evidence until, the case is solved. But as soon as he walked in, he saw there was a vodka bottle that clearly had been moved. And his first thought is are you kidding me? Is this us? Are one of our techs moving stuff and not putting it back? Are we tampering with our own evidence? Or worse, has somebody somehow broken in here and moved things around, without our own guards knowing about it? What's going on here? And at the same time Finch is faced with this new reality here, one of the other investigators pointed to the bedroom door, which was closed. And he said that he'd been here when the forensics team had left, and he was positive they had left that door open. And so Finch is totally flabbergasted. He walks over to the door and he turns the doorknob and tries to open it, but clearly there is something blocking the door, somebody put something on the other side of the door to keep it from opening up all the way. And so at this point, Finch and the other guys began basically ramming on this door until finally they were able to push it open just enough that they could look inside. And when they did, they find the missing third person, Attila Ban. He's lying face down on the bed, he was naked, and he was covered in blood. It would turn out the murders did take place during that party. The killer was there with Alice, Tibor, and Attila. And the killer, at some point during this party, after those other two guests had left, they saw Alice and Tibor kissing. And it drove them mad with jealousy. And they grabbed a knife, and for a short period, they went into an absolute frenzy, repeatedly stabbing Alice brutally until she was dead, and then turning their attention and stabbing Tibor twice in the heart. And so they had brutally killed these two in a total fit of rage. But the killer knew there were some loose ends inside of this apartment. And so very carefully, they slinked their way into the bedroom, and with that same knife they had just used to kill those two, they cut open the side of the mattress, and they crawled inside, and they waited. When Detective Finch first left the apartment, that first time he was there, and he's leaving to go speak to the hotel workers, when he opened the apartment door and he began to leave, he stopped because he noticed something weird. He didn't pursue it right then and there because he wanted to prioritize the interviews, but what he noticed was there's so much blood inside of this apartment. It's everywhere. The techs are telling me to be careful where I step so I don't track blood around, but he's looking down, he's just opened the door to the apartment, and there's no blood leaving the apartment. All the blood is contained inside of the apartment. How is that possible? Well, the reason it was possible is because the killer never left the apartment. And so fast forward 2 days to August 12th, the same day that Detective Finch and his team came back to the apartment to do another sweep. So earlier that same day, the killer is still inside the mattress, but they know now they have to deal with Attila. And so very carefully, the killer slides out of the mattress they've masterfully been hiding in for the past 2 days undetected. And for reasons not fully understood, they ended up moving some things in the apartment, like that vodka bottle that was moved. And then also they went back inside the bedroom with Attila, and they barricaded the door shut with something heavy. So they're barricaded inside the very room they've been hiding in. And now it's time to deal with Attila. And so the killer gets on the mattress, and they take their own clothes off, and they cut their wrists. Because it turns out the killer was Attila. They are the same person. And Attila was madly in love with his roommate, Tibor.
And at that party, when he saw Tibor kissing Alice, he knew that his love was unrequited. And it threw him into a rage, and he stabbed and killed both of them. And then he sort of arranged Tibor, his love, in this sort of strange position, which probably was because he had such strong feelings for him. And then also when he attempted to take his own life 2 days later, when he staged his own death on the bed there, he sort of arranged himself in the same pose. But again, he didn't die. And so after Finch and his detectives broke into the room, they found Attila, they were able to get him to a hospital and treat him. And then once he was stable, he was arrested, found guilty of the murders, and sentenced to 26 years in prison.
Around 6:30 p.m. on December 10th, 1991, a 22-year-old security guard named Brian Ruff sat inside of a guard shack at the Kennecott copper mine in northern Utah, reading a college textbook. The shack was barely big enough for one person to sit inside of, and there were windows on all four sides looking out into the total darkness. The sun was already down, and this was a really isolated part of the mine with no lights or other buildings nearby, so apart from a little bit of moonlight on the snow, it was basically pitch black outside. Brian had worked as a security guard for this mine for a little over a year, but he'd only been stationed at this particular guard shack for a couple of weeks now. And in his opinion, it was the worst post he could have been assigned to. His job was to guard this chain link gate on a remote service road that led into the canyons. This was a really out-of-the-way entrance into the mine, which meant that not a lot of vehicles came this way. So the job was basically just really boring. But it was also simultaneously very dangerous. The Kennecott copper mine was known as the richest hole on Earth because of the huge amount of valuable materials buried there, including obviously copper and gold and silver. And that made it a big target for thieves. In fact, in just the past few months, more than $150,000 worth of material and equipment had been stolen from the mine. So as a result, Brian was a little bit nervous about being out here in the middle of nowhere. Not only because it was, pitch black outside, but also he was unarmed and there were no security cameras. So if he did encounter thieves, he basically had to handle it by himself, armed with nothing more than a telephone to call for help. But on this particular night, his shift had been, routine so far, slow and uneventful. So Brian was now just sort of passing the time studying. He was in nursing school and his final exams were coming up in a few days, so he was just sort of poring over his textbooks and notes to prepare. While he studied, he took out his thermos full of soup that he had brought for dinner. And just as he began eating the soup, the phone on his desk rang. Now, Brian immediately did want to answer the phone because he knew very likely it was his wife, Jennifer. But at the same time, right now, things at home were not great. Jennifer worked as a nurse's aide, and Brian had also started working nights at the mine to help support the family while he went to nursing school during the day. But even with both of them working, it was hard to make ends meet. And now Jennifer was pregnant again with their second child, which was going to make things even harder financially. And the pressure of juggling school and work and parenthood had been putting a big strain on their marriage. And about a month ago, Brian had sort of reached a breaking point, and he'd actually walked out on his family. He'd left a note for Jennifer saying he just needed time alone to think. And then he had driven to his work, he had turned in his security badge and told his boss he quit. Then he had left town, and he'd spent almost a week in Las Vegas. And eventually, he'd driven all the way out to San Francisco. But while he was there, having his time alone, he'd received word that his daughter was in the emergency room with pneumonia back home in Utah. And for Brian, it was like that was his wake-up call. He realized he could not live with himself if he truly abandoned his family. And so he drove right back to Utah to be with Jennifer and to be with his daughter, who would make a recovery. And, Jennifer, she would take Brian back, despite, him walking out on the family, at least for a short time. But her accepting him back into the fold did not sort of make them return to normal. In reality, after he returned, there just was this constant sense that there was tension hanging over their relationship because of what Brian had done, abandoning them. So now, in the guard shack, Brian took a deep breath, and then he picked up the ringing phone, and for a few minutes, he just chatted on the phone, until he suddenly saw something out the window. A flash of headlights coming up the road towards his guard shack. And so at this point, Brian said he had to go, he hung up, and went right outside to meet the approaching vehicle. About an hour and a half later, so around 8 p.m., Brian's boss, Todd Fallows, pulled up to the gate next to the guard shack. The shack's lights were on, but he couldn't see anybody inside of it. And Todd found this pretty odd, because Brian wasn't supposed to leave his post under any circumstance. That was sort of like the main component to the job. You stay put. But making this even stranger was Brian's car was parked right next to the shack. And this shack is so far away from every other building that really there was no way for Brian to go anywhere without his car, especially not, in the freezing cold like it was that night. So where was Brian? And so Todd, who was definitely feeling a bit apprehensive at this point, he parked his car, he got out, and he walked into the shack. And when he got in there, it's a very small space, but Brian, was not in there, but there was a hat and a half-eaten dinner on the desk inside. And so at this point, Todd felt like, we have an issue. Like, I don't know where Brian is. Something seems off. So he picked up the phone inside the shack, and he called the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Department. Less than an hour later, Detective Manny Lassig drove down a snowy desert road toward the Kennecott copper mine. Now, everybody knew this mine was a target for thieves. So when the sheriff's department got a call that a security guard had seemingly vanished into thin air in the middle of his shift, well, Detective Lassig went out right away to investigate, because the thought was, this could have been perpetrated by thieves. Maybe, Brian's been kidnapped or something. When Lassig pulled up to the mine's main entrance, there was another vehicle parked right in front, and it flashed its headlights at him. And then a man in a security guard's uniform rolled down the driver's side window and sort of waved Lassig over. And so Lassig pulled up next to this car, and the man in this other car told Lassig that he was Todd Fallows, the supervisor who had called in about the missing guard. Then after that, Todd started up his engine and told Lassig to follow him. And so he did. He followed him off into the darkness, driving down this dark, winding road that led into the canyons. The Kennecott mine was 3 square miles wide, with rocky terrain and mountains on every side. So they were driving for a good 10 minutes before finally Lassig saw this light up ahead, which was the guard shack that Brian had been in. The two men pulled up near this shack and got out of their vehicles. And then Todd told Detective Lassig that this shack was where the guard, Brian Ruff, had last been stationed. And so Lassig, he turned on his flashlight and then aimed it at the ground right outside of the shack. But there wasn't much to see. It had been snowing all evening, so any footprints or tire tracks that might have helped them were now covered up. And so Lassig stepped inside of the shack. And at first glance, everything looked to be in order. There was no blood, nothing overturned, no sign of a struggle. But again, there was a hat, Brian's hat, and also Brian's half-eaten thermos of soup, his dinner, that was still just sitting on the desk, which was pretty conspicuous. And so Lassig is kind of taking the whole scene in, trying to make sense of what could have happened, coming up with maybe some theories here, looking for any clues of where to look next. And as he was doing that, the phone on the desk rang. And Detective Lassig just picked it up, and he asked who was calling. And the woman on the line sounded very surprised, and she said her name was Jennifer Ruff, and she was trying to reach out to her husband, Brian Ruff. Lassig quickly explained that he was with the sheriff's department, and that her husband Brian had at some point this night left his post and now couldn't be found, and so he was literally looking for her husband. And so he asked Jennifer when was the last time she had spoken to Brian. And Jennifer, she was obviously taken aback by this news, but she said she had just spoken with her husband a couple hours ago. She said they were talking, and then suddenly Brian had to hang up because he said he saw a car coming up the road. Lassig asked her if Brian had said anything specific about this particular car that was approaching, or, who was driving the car or anything. But Jennifer said no, he didn't say anything, just that the car was coming and he had to go. Lassig was obviously disappointed that there wasn't more information here, but he still thanked Jennifer and told her, I promise I will be in touch with you as soon as I possibly can. I'm going to go out there and find your husband. Then he hung up the phone and he turned his attention back to the scene, the inside of this very small shack. But just a few seconds after he had put the phone down, the phone rang again. And so Lassig picked it up again, and once again, it was a woman saying she was Brian's wife, Jennifer. And she was asking where Brian was. But as Lassig is listening, he's thinking, this woman doesn't sound anything like the woman I just spoke to literally a minute ago, who also said she was Brian's wife, Jennifer. And also, this second woman clearly doesn't have any recollection of the earlier conversation. Like, These are two different people who are both claiming to be Brian's wife, Jennifer. But obviously there could only be one, so one of these women had to be lying, right? On a morning in mid-December of 1991, so just a few days after Brian Ruff's disappearance from his remote guard shack, and still he had not been found yet, Detective Manny Lassig sat down with a cup of coffee in the Ruff's dining room across from Brian's wife, Jennifer. The investigation had been moving slowly so far because, for the first few days, everyone had been hoping that Brian would just return on his own. But as the days passed and he still hadn't been heard from, that was looking less and less likely. By this point, Detective Lassig had traced the phone numbers of both women who had called the guard shack on the night Brian disappeared, claiming to be his wife Jennifer. And he had quickly found out that one of those calls was actually from Jennifer Ruff's work phone number, which meant very likely that was the real Jennifer Ruff. But Lassig was still trying to figure out why another woman had called and impersonated her. And also, the timing of the calls was odd. It happened one right after the other. It was just a very strange coincidence. So now, as Lassig sat across from the real Jennifer Ruff, he started out by asking her where she had been on the night Brian disappeared. She told him she had been at the hospital all night working, and then she gave Lassig names of some of her coworkers who could verify that. At this point, Lassig completely pivoted and just asked Jennifer point blank, "Is there any chance your husband could have been having an affair? Were there other women in his life? Was he acting secretive or just odd lately? Anything to indicate, that he was maybe unfaithful?" The reason Lassig asked, obviously, was because of the second woman who he knew had called and pretended to be Brian's wife. He had no idea if the real Jennifer knew, but certainly he did. And the real Jennifer, when she heard this question, she just sort of looked down and then she looked up and she said, "Yes, I am suspicious of that." She told Lassig that she and Brian had been having some real issues in their marriage lately, and in fact, just the previous month, Brian had sort of inexplicably, ran out on the family because he needed time alone, and he was gone and out of contact for that whole time until he just came back begging to be taken back. At this point, Lassig, when he heard that part, he sat back in his chair and wondered if he was just wasting his time on this case to begin with. Because if Brian had previously left and then eventually came back after being totally out of contact, well, what's to say he wasn't doing that right now? What if this was him again, sort of running off to be alone and he would just turn back up again at some point? But Jennifer must have noticed that that's sort of where Lassig's mind was going, because she rushed to add in that, the last time when he ran out for that week, he had left a note for her and even told his boss that he was quitting. There was some warning before he left. She sort of made it dramatic, but he definitely told people before he was going to be gone. In fact, she became insistent that really it was not like Brian to not give warning. For him to just vanish mid-shift like that, like he's done right now, that's not something Brian would do. He's got some faults, but that's not something he would do. Detective Lassig asked Jennifer where Brian had actually gone when he disappeared that first time. And Jennifer answered him by handing him a piece of mail from a nearby table. She explained that it was a credit card bill that had come in the mail that week, and it was addressed to Brian. And she explained that she was pretty confused when she got this, because she didn't even know Brian had a credit card. But he apparently did, and he used it while he was away to pay for hotels and meals and other expenses. And so Lassig, he pulled out the bill and began to look it over, and he saw that a lot of the charges were made in Las Vegas and San Francisco. And the amounts that were being charged to restaurants and for room service seemed a bit too large for just one person. He looked up from the bill back at Jennifer, and just from the expression on her face, he knew that they had both drawn the same conclusion. Brian, when he was away for that week, likely had not been alone. Jennifer then grabbed another piece of paper from the counter and gave that to Lassig. This was a phone bill for the family's landline, with a full list of every call that had been made and received in the past month. Jennifer said there were definitely some numbers on this list that she didn't recognize, and she thought maybe one of them could be this person that Brian had been traveling with. And as Lassig looked over this list, one of the phone numbers immediately stood out to him, because that woman who had called the guard shack on the night Brian disappeared and pretended to be Jennifer, basically called right after the real Jennifer, that one, that phone number that was used for the fake Jennifer was the number he was now seeing on this list. Later that same day, Lassig sat down in the living room of the house that was associated with that phone number. And sitting across from him was a young woman named Christy Bradley. Her husband, Dale Bradley, was also a security guard at the Kennecott mine where Brian worked. Now, at the moment, Dale wasn't home, but it wasn't really clear when he would get home, and Lassig was really anxious to interview Christy alone, so before her husband got back. So the instant they sat down, Lassig pretty much just cut to the chase. He told Christy that he was nearly positive she and Brian had been having an affair. And then before she could say anything, he pulled out that bill that Jennifer had given him and showed her all the evidence. Christy, when she saw this, for a second looked defiant, but then just broke down and admitted it was true. She said they'd been seeing each other for a while now, and in fact, the month before, they had run away together for about a week. But even though they had ultimately come back and they both went back to their respective families, she said that they had still been very much in touch. Christy said that was the reason she had called the guard shack on the night Brian disappeared, just to call and just be in touch with him. That was it. But she said when the person answered, and it was a voice that was unfamiliar, it was Detective Lassig, she said that sort of on instinct, she just began to lie and pretended to be Jennifer, Brian's real wife, just so, their affair would not come to light. But Christy made it very clear that she had not heard from Brian since he disappeared, and she had no clue what happened to him. At this point, Lassig sat back on the couch and just looked at Christy, kind of sizing her up. And he thought, she seemed pretty genuinely worried about Brian. And even though the call she had made to the guard shack was ultimately very suspicious and pretty bizarre, her explanation for it did make sense. But at this point, he was certainly not going to rule her out as a suspect quite yet. Also, Lassig knew that Christy's husband, Dale, was also now clearly a primary suspect. Because, if he had found out about this affair, he could have easily hurt Brian in retaliation. The following day, Lassig walked into an interrogation room at the sheriff's station where Dale was already seated and waiting for him. And the moment Lassig walked in, Dale immediately asked him if there was any news about Brian. Lassig said no, not yet. And it seemed to him like Dale's disappointment was genuine, like he was worried about him. Lassig sat down and he asked Dale about how long he'd known Brian for. And Dale said they had met maybe about a year ago when Brian started working at the mine, and they'd become pretty close friends. They'd even hung out together outside of work. At this point, Lassig, almost to catch Dale off guard, he pivoted sort of abruptly and just asked Dale point blank about his wife's affair. And Dale, when he heard that his wife was having an affair, seemed sort of stunned, and he said he didn't know anything about Christy having an affair. At this point, Lassig just explained to him what his wife had already told him. And Dale appeared genuinely upset. Like, the idea she was cheating on him was horrible, especially with someone he considered clearly to be a close friend. And so as Dale is sort of reacting to this really shocking news, Lassig asked him where he was on the night of December 10th when Brian disappeared. And so Dale, who again is sort of like dealing with the shocking news he's just been told, for a moment he just was unable to answer. He ultimately composed himself and he said that actually his car had gotten stuck in the snow while he was at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, almost an hour away from the mine. And in fact, he had even had to call a friend to come get him out of the snow. And then he gave Lassig the name of this friend so he could call and confirm it. After taking down this friend's name, Lassig told Dale that he really wanted him to take a polygraph test, and also they would have to search his car. And Dale agreed to both, with no hesitation. One morning, a few weeks later, Lassig walked across a parking lot toward an office building at the Kennecott mine. So far, Brian had still not turned up, and the search for him had been frustrating because none of the people Lassig had questioned so far had given him any useful information. Dale Bradley, along with his wife, Christy Bradley, had both taken polygraph tests, and both had passed. Lassig had also searched the red Mustang that Dale drove, but there was no evidence in it that linked Dale to Brian's disappearance. Plus, the friend who had helped Dale get his Mustang out of the snow had confirmed he had done that, so his alibi was solid. So at this point, Dale and Christy were sort of unofficially off the suspect list. Lassig had also considered the fact that maybe Jennifer, the real Jennifer, so Brian's actual wife, maybe she was involved in her husband's disappearance, despite how, honestly she came across. Now, her coworkers had confirmed she had been at work all evening on the night Brian disappeared, but it wasn't impossible that she could have maybe been working with an accomplice or maybe hired somebody to kill Brian or something. But with no evidence against her and also no body, Brian has not been found here, all Lassig really had here was just a hunch that, maybe she was involved, but who knows. However, just a few days ago, Lassig had received a new lead that sent his investigation in a new direction. That was why he was here right now at the Kennecott mine to speak to Brian's supervisor, Todd Fallows. So Lassig went inside the building and made his way down the hallway to Todd's office. And when Todd saw the detective, he jumped up and he very eagerly greeted him and said he would do whatever he had to do to try to help find Brian. Lassig thanked him, but told Todd to sit back down. And then Lassig sat down as well, and then he pulled out a tape recorder and he hit record. And then he told Todd why he was there. 2 of Brian's fellow security guards had just been arrested for stealing precious metal and equipment from the mine and then selling it at pawn shops. In fact, the investigation had discovered that a whole ring of Kennecott employees were involved in these thefts. Todd sort of began to shift in his chair and said he had heard about that, but he insisted he was never involved in any of these thefts. And he said he'd already been questioned by detectives from the Property Crimes Division. Lassig said he understood that, and that was not really why he was here. He said when he looked through the records of the investigation about these thefts, he'd found out that Brian had actually been the one who reported some of the thefts that were going on. So now Lassig wondered if maybe on the night of Brian's disappearance, he'd stopped one of his coworkers' vehicles and found stolen materials inside, and maybe they had killed him to keep him quiet. Todd sat back in his chair and looked sort of lost in thought for a moment, and then he admitted that, yeah, that could be possible. He then told Detective Lassig he could actually think of several places on the mine's property where maybe Brian's body was hidden by these, fellow employees if they did this. And then as an example, he suggested the gravel pile by the concentrator, which crushes the minerals and grinds them up. Todd explained that if Brian had been placed there, he would have very likely gotten sucked into the grinders and pulverized with all the other rocks. He'd basically be gone. Detective Lassig was surprised by how specific Todd was being. Todd had really come up with this theory very quickly. So, sensing that Todd might be a little suspicious here, he just let Todd keep going. And Todd did. He just kept spitting out all these theories about maybe what could have happened to Brian, including at one point, he said maybe Brian could have been hidden under the waste piles, where weeks' worth of crushed boulders would have already fallen down and completely covered him up. And he said if that had happened, if Brian had been hidden in a place like that, he would already be buried under several tons of rock at this point, and the police would never find him. On July 10th, 1993, so a year and a half after Brian Ruff disappeared, Detective Lassig drove through a barren desert in Utah about 50 miles south of Kennecott Mine. There had been basically no progress on the case for over a year. The sheriff's department had spent countless hours scouring the mine with police dogs and helicopters, looking for any sign that Brian might have been killed or buried or hidden somewhere there. But so far, there was still no trace of Brian. Now, Lassig was confident that there had to have been foul play involved, but it was impossible to prove that when he didn't have a body or evidence that tied any of his suspects to the crime. For months, Lassig's team had looked into every single security guard at the Kennecott mine, especially the ones who had been implicated in that theft ring, but they had ultimately verified that every guard on duty was at their post at the time Brian disappeared. And they'd collected alibis from everyone who was not scheduled to work that night. And so they had not been able to actually link any guards to Brian's disappearance, and that also included Brian's supervisor, Todd Fallows, who seemed, very eager to offer up these very specific theories. He too was not linked to Brian's disappearance. However, Todd was ultimately linked to that theft ring. As for Christy Bradley, the woman Brian was having an affair with, and Christy's husband, Dale, those two, they had alibis, they passed a lie detector test, and really had been ruled out much earlier on in the investigation, and nothing new had come up over the last year to change that, so they were still ruled out. And then as for Brian's wife, Jennifer, Lassig at one point thought maybe she was involved, maybe she had an accomplice or something. She certainly had the motive, to potentially harm her husband. Their marriage was on the rocks. He had clearly been having an affair and she was on to him. But she really had been at work at the time he disappeared, and there was no link from her to any potential accomplice. And so it went nowhere. She was ruled out too. So again, after more than a year, the case basically had gone cold. However, that particular morning, the investigation had been reinvigorated because a group of campers had called in and said they had found skeletal remains out in the desert. Lassig knew this was obviously a long shot, but he was holding out hope that maybe it was Brian. So when he arrived at the location the campers had described, Lassig got out of his car and he walked a short distance across the barren ground to where a forensics team was setting up crime scene tape in the brush. As Lassig got closer to the crime scene, he could see a human skeleton lying in a shallow grave. The skeleton was clothed in a dust-covered dark blue jacket, and when Lassig crouched down to get a better look, he saw that it was clearly a security guard's uniform. Lassig put on some gloves and then searched the pockets of this jacket, and his fingers immediately landed on a wallet. And when he pulled it out and he looked inside, he found ID cards and credit cards with the name Brian Ruff. Now, at this point, it seemed fairly apparent that the body had to belong to Brian, but because the body was so decomposed, they would have to examine Brian's dental records to definitively ID him, which would take some time. So, while the crime scene techs carefully loaded the remains into a van, Lassig stayed at the scene with the canine unit that was searching for any other evidence nearby. And sure enough, just a few feet away from where the body had been, Lassig found 5 shotgun shells lying in the dirt. It looked like Brian, very likely, had been shot 5 times and then buried in this shallow grave. Then, just a few yards away from the shells, a police dog began barking, and an officer called Lassig over to look at what the dog had found. He walked over, and the officer held up a black work boot, and there was a pretty obvious bullet hole through the leather. And so Lassig figured the boot must have belonged to Brian. But other than this boot and Brian's actual body, 18 months of heat and, wind and sand and snow and rain out in this desert had basically erased any other traces of forensic evidence. So even though Lassig at this point felt very confident that he knew both where Brian was ultimately killed and how he was killed, because of this severe lack of forensic evidence, he was worried that he might not actually be any closer to figuring out who killed Brian. 12 years later, on April 30th, 2005, Detective Todd Park of the Salt Lake City Sheriff's Office got a call from the Sheriff's Department in the next county over. Since the beginning of the year, Detective Park had been working full-time on solving various cold cases. The detective on the line told him that he was investigating a recent homicide, and he thought it might be connected to one of Park's cold cases, specifically the murder of Brian Ruff. After speaking to this detective, Park hung up the phone and went right over to his filing cabinet and dug through until he found Brian's file. He sat down and began sorting through the decade-old papers, and he realized that there was a tiny piece of evidence the original investigators had somehow overlooked. And upon closer examination, Park realized it was actually the key to unlocking the entire case. Based on forensic evidence, this is what police believe happened to Brian Ruff on December 10th, 1991. Around 6:30 p.m., the killer drove down a winding service road toward a very isolated part of Kennecott Mine. Up ahead, they saw a single light in the distance. It was coming from a small guard shack right next to a chain-link gate. The killer pulled right up outside of the shack and parked their car and then got out. And then seconds later, Brian Ruff came out of the guard shack and waved hello. And the killer sort of waved back and walked over to Brian, and then as soon as they were close enough, the killer grabbed Brian whipped him around, tied his hands behind his back, and then forced Brian, before he could do anything, into the back of the vehicle. At this point, the killer jumped into the driver's seat, did a U-turn, and sped out of the mine towards the desert. And as they were driving, the killer heard Brian screaming and kicking in the back, doing everything he could to try to escape. But the killer was unfazed. They stayed calm and just kept on driving for nearly an hour, all while Brian's acting crazy in back, until they eventually reached another very remote spot way out in the desert about 50 miles away. There, they pulled off the road and they stopped their vehicle right in this open, snow-covered patch of desert. They climbed out, they went to the back seat, and they opened the door up, and they grabbed Brian, who was still fighting and trying to escape, but he was pretty tired at this point, and the killer dragged Brian out. And as they dragged Brian out, Brian began pleading for mercy and promised that if they just let him go, he would never tell anyone about this. But the killer just grabbed a shovel and a shotgun from their vehicle, untied Brian, and then forced him at gunpoint to dig his own grave. And then when Brian was done, the killer just raised their shotgun and shot Brian 5 times. And then after he was dead, they dropped his body into the grave he had literally dug himself. And then the killer got back into their vehicle, a red Mustang. But when the killer tried to leave, their vehicle, the Mustang, got stuck in the snow. And so they had to call a friend who did come out, who had no idea a murder has just been committed literally right over there. There's a body buried, right over there. They didn't know. They helped the killer get out of the snow, and off they drove. The killer was Dale Bradley, the co-worker whose wife Brian was having an affair with. Dale's alibi that he had been an hour away, his car was stuck in the snow on the night Brian disappeared, well, it was true. Except that wasn't an alibi. He was basically describing being at the crime scene and having another friend come and help him flee the crime scene. But the friend, who absolutely said, yep, he was an hour away, I helped him get his car out of the snow, the friend had no idea. This is where a murder has just taken place. And so they told the truth, and Dale sort of acted like, yep, that's my alibi. And the police never checked. And so they didn't realize that that wasn't an alibi. It was basically a description of where the crime scene was. Additionally, Dale took a polygraph early on in the investigation, and he did pass it. So he really was dismissed as a suspect very early on. And so Dale and Christy had eventually gotten divorced, likely over the affair, and Dale had ultimately remarried. But when his second wife, Crystal, was murdered in 2005, the detective investigating that murder noticed that Dale had been sort of indirectly connected to now 2 people who had been murdered, Crystal and Brian. And he thought it was suspicious enough that he got in touch with Detective Park, the detective who was in charge of all these cold cases, and he told Park, hey, you ought to take a closer look at Dale in the Brian Ruff cold case murder. And so that prompted Detective Park to not just take a closer look at Dale, but really at the whole Brian Ruff case file. And when he did that, he noticed this really small piece of evidence that sort of went overlooked. And that piece of evidence was a tiny speck of red paint on the sole of that black work boot, which had been found near Brian's body out in the desert. And Park was eventually able to match that paint to the same paint on the inside of the trunk of Dale's red Mustang. Dale Bradley was charged with Brian Ruff's murder on September 19, 2005. In 2007, he pleaded guilty to lesser charges of manslaughter and kidnapping and was ultimately sentenced to 40 years in prison. As for Crystal, Dale's second wife who was murdered, her case remains unsolved.